Yeah, I went out and I had to come back again. So, yeah, can you see the screen, please?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So on the right side, you can see bottom the comparison with respect to USA. You can see again we are way below compared to that. What seems important is not so much the apart from GRD, the other important thing seems to be the amount of exports that are there. No, that again is quite high for China as well as US, but not so much for India. And if you look at the left-hand bottom, you can see with respect to Brazil, which is one of the big countries, you can see there Brazil is also close to the median in terms of GRD ratio. And so with respect to researchers per thousand employment, we are in the same ballpark as Brazil and China per thousand employment. What's the GDP? And that is one thing which this STIP doesn't address at all. They just very glibly say that the GRD will double every 5 years. On what basis that is being said and how, what are the provisions? Nothing is there. So I move on to the next slide. And that is just to show you the process with the science, the STIP process had taken place. It's given there in sciencepolicyforum.org. You can see that it's a very comprehensive process. A lot of discussions went on in different tracks, but not with the members of the parliament. That's one area which I want to also mention, that all the discussions have been outside, and the proposed work plan and timeline, you can see that here, we are at this part of the final draft here to the public. And after that, of course, the timeline is a little extended because this was supposed to be in October, November. Now we are in January. So now once this is over, it gets submitted to the cabinet, right? So, and then they had various things. They had a lot of engagements, town halls and so on. But the bottom part of it is that I had also taken part in these discussions. The problem is that one of the discussions at the town hall meeting where there's people, and it is a, yeah, I'm sorry for the connection. I think it keeps breaking. So the point is that, as what Shan also said, like what happened for the NEP, they had this huge amount of responses, but what are the responses and what is going to be done with them, that is not clear. The same thing happens with the STIP, even at the start, even though there's a huge, there is zero transparency in terms of how, what information that is given has been put into the draft feedback that is going to be given. So this is a major problem. So I will move on to my thing where I basically try to look at 9 points which I've given here. These are the 9 points that I'll be talking about. And what I've done is I've taken sentences from the draft policy to sort of re-emphasize these points. So you can see points is that the vision is poor, is not an independent policy, very much it's a corporate and elite interests come in. There is a role of states is completely not considered, and the ground realities and funding issues are not taken into account. And like the NEP, this is very nicely written. It'll win many essay contests, but Many of the words, sentences are, what do they actually mean? They're just hollow words. The music is not there. Then there are some partly redeeming features in that the whole LGBTQ community has been mentioned. That itself is great. And then there's a talk of open science, and some of the science communication part is okay. Still, some more needs to be done. What needs to be done, my thing is that we need transparency in the whole process. If there's no transparency in the drafting of the policy and the submission of the policy and thing, in the implementation also, there's going to be zero transparency, like what is happening with the NEP. There'll be all backdoor implementation that happens. The other thing is that there has to be a parliamentary standing committee for science and technology innovation. This is a recommendation coming from UNESCO, where they have said that countries like in Europe and I think they have these committees, parliamentary committees which go into this. We don't have that. We have only a committee for science and technology, which doesn't really discuss the policy. The policy has not been run through them at all. Then we need a federated approach. All the databases and all, they talk of a centralized one. What we need is a federated set of data sets and also decision making and implementation. And one other point which I like to mention is that in the science communication part, they talk of creating a new science movement. I think the existing people science movement should be used. So I'll just go on to the details. Over the years, you can see that the science policy, if nothing else, has grown in number of pages. From 2 pages in 1958, it has become 62 pages in 2020. And very more people-oriented policies you see at the beginning, and post 1990, you see that there's a lot of thing about getting into the global powers and forgetting the people. So the people aspect gets lost after 2013, more or less. And 2020 policy is extremely disappointing, especially the huge amount of discussions, online tracks and discussions that took place. The policy is very verbose and has a lot of stuff written, but seems to be lacking any ground reality at all. And the other interesting thing is, you can see the moment innovation gets added, there's a jump in the number of pages of the policy from 9 to 22 and this thing. So the innovation seems to be an expensive process, at least in terms of writing. All right, so what about the vision of the policy? Obviously, it's not a 2020 vision. The question is policies for whom and for what. The first part which they say is to achieve technological self-reliance among the top 3 scientific powers. In the 2013 policy, they had said that it will become one of the 5 powers in the thing. So obviously the number keeps increasing, but with scant respect to what actually our position is. As you saw on the GRD to GDP ratio, we are way below in the less than 25% category of the quartile. So the other thing is, what does it mean when you become a top 3 of the scientific powers? Does it solve the problems of the people? And that is what the 1958 policy said, that the science and technology be used to alleviate the suffering of the people, to alleviate the various problems faced by the people. And that seems to have gotten right in the middle. And the other vision, which is talking of the attract, nurture, people-centric. Now, how and which people is it going to be attracting and nurturing? No, that again is completely blank. There's nothing in the policy which says which are the people who are going to be targeted and how this process is going to be done. And the third one is a blitz statement of saying that they'll double the number of full-time equivalent researchers and the GERD every 5 years. And it's because now really how is going to happen? It's not happened over the past 20 years. How is it suddenly going to happen next over the 5 years? And the fourth part of the vision is that this really takes the cake. No, they want to talk of using ASTI for achieving the highest level of global recognition awards. It's like saying you go to school because you want to win some prizes. Obviously, personally, Venki has also said that science flourishes only when people are free to question authority, and that is what this science, technology, innovation policy just fails to address. Why is it that there is a lack of innovation? Why is it there is a lack of free thinking that happens in this? And how can you frame a policy, a national policy, merely to get awards and recognitions? So this is obviously a blinkered policy without any vision. And the last sentence, I usually read it. I know is you. I don't know how how many can even understand what the sentence means. It's just way off, and many of the sentences in the policy are like this. It's just a whole joining together of words which really make not much mean. And then they talk of aspirations. Aspirations of whom? No, are they talking only the corporates or the elite? So the next point that I want to say is that the policy is not an independent policy. It's full of catchphrases of this Atma Nirbhar Bharat, which every official seems to want to spout now in this climate. And then this other tag of traditional knowledge systems. They talk of integrating traditional knowledge systems, or the same way talk of becoming the third superpower in the world. No, so and then this thing of integrating traditional knowledge with grassroots innovation. Again, this grassroots innovation is a catchphrase which nobody seems to have any idea in the policy what they're talking about. They're not single example of what they're trying to mean by that. And the other important part is this policy tries to push the NEP, which itself is not even cleared with the parliament. No, it's a backdoor policy. And this NEP is being thrust even into this step. And this is the first science and technology policy which links to other policies, especially policies which have not yet been cleared by the parliament. And no other science and technology policy refers to any of the education policy or other policies. And there are a variety of other points I've given at various things. You can see this tendency to try and link heritage with this traditional knowledge system. Again, that's a big bugbear, which is obviously the origins of this is clearly seen and where it comes from. And so in the same vein, I've just given you additional thing. And look at this. No, they page 40, they talk of differently able individuals, including Divyangan. This phrase is such a wrong phrase. And what prevents the people who are writing the policy to drop that phrase? They can just say differently able individuals become special. All this because they want to be a psychopath to the power, saying, okay, we are using all the phrases that the National Research Foundation, again, an NEP product, which is not, which has its own problems. Okay, the next point is about, there are various things where the question comes of who's taking the decisions and who's going to benefit. Is it the corporate is going to benefit, or is it a very elite policy? Because a lot of things about the caste equation, which are very blithely written here. No, if you look at, they talk about addressing local problems. Now, who's going to decide the local problems? And also, they at the same breath they talk of ensuring R&D aligns with industry needs, and the fact that it must be prioritized, especially in manufacturing sectors, and their focus on enabling private players to thrive in the international market. Right? And this really takes the cake. On page 39, they talk of equity thing in science and technology innovation is not only to be seen from point of view of correcting historical injustices and compensating for earlier deprivations, but also to make real impact, as if this earlier point of reservation has not made any impact at all. I know the whole idea is same as in the NEP. You talk down on reservation, don't mention it, and then bring in a new set of words which are used here. And then they go on to looking at multi-stakeholder, where they talk about city-based and contractor-operated things. So clearly, it's a very elitist thing. Which if you look at the page 21, they also talk of incorporating foreign direct investment into the whole process. So it's again like what happens in NEP is a way of getting the foreign direct investment into education, higher education, and here they want to bring it into the whole area of science, technology, and research. So this again, policy is meant to favor corporates and elites, and the decision making seems to be completely non-transparent. And this, So the other, like in the NEP, there are a lot of characteristics are similar to the NEP. No, it's as if the system selects such policies just as it selects people. You can have you go to vice chancellor selection thing. You find that whole process looks very straightforward. Everything as per law is followed, but in the end, they will at least in Tamil Nadu, they will select the vice chancellor. Earlier, who was paying money, now who is a part of the will kowtow to the central government on this. So this is what the whole idea is, that everything seems to be okay, but then it misses the whole spirit of the constitution of having the states having a role to play. No, they talk of engaged university. What is engaged university? That is a phrase, a completely meaningless phrase. And are they talking only central universities or state universities? Is going to be done? There's no such thing. It talks only, uses the same phrases as the NEP of HEIs, which is a term that has been coined by the NEP. Then they talk of a capacity building authority. Again, it's a centralized one. Nothing to do with the at each state level what will be the authority that is there. On a STA policy institute. Again, this is a overarching body which is going to be a centralized one. And there's other strategic technology board. Again, something which, say, all over you find that it's the states are completely left out in the whole process of any authority building, just as it happened in NEP with that. The other important point is that policy doesn't mention even ground would not be done, and unless you examine the history and you examine what is the cause of that, there's no way to correct it. And so they just make these statements that this will be done, without even telling about why it did not work earlier and where are the funds going to come from. They talk of setting up a national STA observatory, an open centralized database, which will have everything: financial schemes, programs, incentives. There's not a single database in this country now which will even have something resembling this. And they talk of making this happen over, and then this other thing of an India-centric equity and inclusion charter for tackling all forms of discrimination. Again, just a blanket statement which says that they will do this. This creating this IND star for having outputs of all publicly funded research. It's like in the NEP, it's all very nice to read, but how can it actually happen? They talk of strong collaborations. India has a very poor history of having collaboration, and that again is the thing. So I just move on. I'm cutting into time. So these are just examples of the same thing. So I'll just skip this. There are various, you can see this many points in that which are there. Then the other point which I have come to is the fact that it's a word play. Many things have, things like, for example, SNT for diplomacy, we complemented the diplomacy for SNT. It sounds very nice, but what does it actually mean? Many of these things are such things which have a whole set of them. You can see this thing, democratization of science through upstream engagement. What does it mean? What does democratization of science through upstream engagement mean? No, democratization science should be making science for all. And where does the upstream engagement come? And this is when everybody is talking of not having metric. Professor Balram, for example, talking of how metrics are destroyed. I'll again share screen, do this again. So my Zoom went out in the middle and come back. So I just mentioned that this is flowing with metrics which will evaluate people, which are not actually meant to evaluate people. So I really puzzled why the STIP with so many people involved who know better has decided to come up with such a phrase. the partly redeeming feature is this thing with the LGBTQ, the open science, and the science compound. I just listed out some of them. Why it's partly because many of things are again statements. For example, everyone in the country on equal partnership basis. They will promote their representation without giving an idea about how it's going to be done or no, how it will be implemented. There are already science media centers, but they have not done much. So what is it that is lacuna with them? So there's a lot of things which are written here, which really have a problem in terms of, even though it's well meaning to have this all mentioned, open science, science communication, and so on. In the science communication part, one other thing is that if you look at, I think page 45, they talk about the focus of the movement is to motivate children and youth to pursue science careers. And what is this? The whole idea of the science movement should be to inculcate scientific temper and develop people with this, not to get people to go in for science career. Policies for enabling people to get awards and recognition on a world basis. All right, so I'm come to the last. I'm sorry, I got cut out again. My thing. So this is my last slide. As I said, we need to have transparency, which seems to be not understandable by these groups. We need to have a parliamentary standing committee for STI, which has to be included. There has to be a federated approach, not a centralized database, centralized approach, not one body that fits everybody, but different bodies for different areas, states, and that could be done. Then they should use existing people science movements and not going for creating new science movements. As I say, that they want to make no, national level science movement for popularizing science. At least this, I think we should be able to push and say you use existing capacity. It's the same thing with the literacy. No, when they found that literacy movement is doing well with this, they shut it down and try to take it on a different platform. So this is my last slide. I've just got a recap of what I said earlier. There's the 9 points which I said. So thank you. Sorry for all these breaks which happened. I'm not sure how many heard what I said or what went across, but in a way it's a bit like the science and technology innovation policy. Half of what they say does not resonate with anybody, or I'm sure they will carry on like the NEP. And as Shan said, I think it is our responsibility as science movements to at least say that this government continues to do such things of having coming out with policies which are not democratic, which are not transparent, which are not implementable. Thank you, Shan. Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Yeah, it was, I mean, it gave us the key points to where we should look for and when we were discussing. I mean, it was good. So without further delay, I'll pass on to the next section where our section is open science development. And Siddharth, if you can take hold of it, it would be good.
Yeah, Sam, I'll share my document. Just yeah, this session is on open science and capacity development. These are our first 2 chapters of STIP policy, and this broadly covers open science. They are actually covering under National STI Observatory, and they are talking about Indian Science and Technology Archive of Research, open data, open access, one nation, one subscription, Indian journals, research facilities, open educational resources, libraries, and learning spaces. So these are all they are covering under the chapter 1 in open science. And then in the chapter 2 is capacity development, under which it's broadly categorized with 3 sections. One is education and research, another one is skill building and training, and another one is infrastructure. Under education and research, it is covering establishing innovation and entrepreneurship centers, representation of ministries of science and technology in NCF working groups of NEP 2020. Then institutionalization of national school and higher education mentorship program, evolving research excellence framework for higher educational institutes in India, and internationalization of R&D. Under skill building and training, it covers ICT and online platforms for skill building, teaching learning centers, focus on hands-on training. And under the infrastructure, they are talking about higher education research centers in line with NEP 2020. Again, they are bringing it based on NEP, National New Education Policy 2020. And collaborative research centers, establishing collaborative research centers, transforming existing R&D institutions to research universities, and then coordinated approach for building and enhancing infra. So on these two topics, we have two panelists with us. One is Professor Jayant Murthy. He is a senior professor in Indian Institute of Astrophysics. Before joining in astrophysics, Professor Jayant Murthy was a research scientist in Johns Hopkins University. And before that, he was a National Research Council Fellowship in NASA GSFC. He is carrying out research in space missions, interstellar dusts, and etc. The another panelist, he is Dr. T.V. Venkateswaran. He is a very senior scientist in Vigyan Prasar, New Delhi. His research area of interest is on history of popular science and science and media. And Dr. TVV advocates that public policies should be produced upon scientific basis so that it can be accepted by all groups of the society. And he has written many books on science popularization and things. Now I invite the panelist, Professor Jayant Murthy, first to give his thing. Professor Jayant Murthy.
Yes, thank you. So Professor Srinivasan actually left me with very little to say because that was, I was basically just going to say whatever he said. And I had warned the Ravindra Banyal when he had asked me. I told him that I had no faith in the STIP because I have no faith in top-down policies. And so this particular topic that we're talking about, the open science and capacity development, those are things that no one can argue against. How can we argue against open science? Science should be open, science should be accessible to all. And clearly we do need capacity development. So I highlighted a few points from the draft STIP, which again, as Dr. Krishnaswamy said, 62 pages is far too long to have a real policy. I mean, it's clearly made up by people who are not scientists per se, or rather who are scientists, but who are not practicing in the institutions we have in the country. If we have a bunch of people like me who are at elite institutions, we really don't have any concept of what happens at colleges, what happens at universities. I gave a talk at Mount Carmel, one of the best colleges in the city, and they didn't know in 2000 and whatever it was, 18, they didn't know that a neutrino had mass. Why? Because their textbooks dated back to 1986, when it was true, neutrinos didn't have a mass in 1986. Now we know that they do have a mass. And so this is the kind of infrastructure, the kind of capacity that we're dealing with. We're dealing with colleges where the motive is not education, the motive is not research, the motive is for the students to get out with a certificate which they can use to get a job. So we have to address all of those issues. And a top-down policy just won't do that. In that way, the STIP, there's been science, technology, innovation. All of these policies have been around since independence. And okay, granted, it was 2 pages in 1950 and 62 pages now, but they've all been around. And at every stage, people wanted science to get better. So in what way this will help where the others did not, without addressing the foundational problems, is not at all clear to me. So as I said, I highlighted a few areas in the STIP. And again, I can't argue with it. To promote open science, the public will have the right to access all outputs from research funded by the central government or the state governments, either directly or through funding agencies or institutions supported by the central government or the state governments. And that's fine. They should all be public. In fact, I thought that they were actually public. I thought this was an extension of RTI, but whatever, it's no harm in stating it explicitly. Aspires to build an ecosystem where research, data, infrastructure, resources, and knowledge are accessible to all. Again, how can I argue that that is undoubtedly true? What bothers me is that these are all set in the future. These are all set in the future. These are all will be done, should be done. It's not, why aren't they done? In astronomy, almost all of our research, almost all of our publications are in fact accessible to everyone. We've been doing it for at least the last 2 decades. There's no thought needed. Now this dedicated portal, INSTA, Indian Science and Technology Archive of Research, INSTAR, I guess. What is the, we should not be developing new things. There are already discipline-specific archives that exist. In astronomy, we have every major observatory has their own archive. There are public repositories of publications like arXiv. So these all exist already. Our own institutions have their own archives. GMRT, the Giant Meter Wave Radio Telescope, they have their own archive. We have our own archive from Hanley. And these are all dedicated to our own data, which are unique to us. Anyone can come here and get our data. Anyone can come here and get our publications. Where is the need to develop a new portal, new technology, new manpower, new personnel? Why do we have to do this? Why not just use what we already have? Where needed, let us build up those areas which do need help. There's no need to do a completely new thing. Then Indian journals. This is something that has really bothered me. We already have again, discipline-specific journals. Science is an international community. It doesn't lend itself well to nationalism. We have a community where we talk to scientists all over the world. One should foster that collaboration. We should bring other people here. We should fund our scientists to go to meetings abroad, to maybe longer collaborative visits. There's no need to develop an Indian journal. That time is gone. In the past, it made sense. It made sense 40 years ago when journals had to be sent by sea. Now everything is electronic, and really, what is the need? We have access at the same time that anyone in the world has it. Particularly with, again, I'm addressing my own area, astronomy specifically. All papers are published in preprint form, or most papers are published in preprint form. There's not even a need to wait for the journal article to come because they're published for free. So what are we doing here? Concentrated efforts will also be made to prevent the publication of fake journals. I mean, sure, great thing. The next one I flagged is something that I actually do think is important. Libraries at public funded institutions will be accessible to the public, subject only to reasonable security protocols. Of course, we know what happens when you use weasel words like reasonable security protocols. It means that reasonably no one can get in. But nevertheless, it has bothered me for a long time that all our institutions are behind gated walls. We're publicly funded institutions. How will it hurt anyone if someone can walk into the Indian Institute of Science or my own Indian Institute of Astrophysics? Why do we need 6-foot walls around? So my basic summary of this open science part is that, yes, I think open science is important. I think that we already have much of the framework we need for open science. And it's not clear to me why we need to invent our own new archives, new ways of doing this. And I should add, by the way, that this is very limiting in a sense. We say STIP, but what about academia in general? As always, we don't count history, we don't count social sciences. These are all part of academia, and they all have a very important role. So when we say that we need to fund science and technology, really it's a broader thing. We have to fill the base. We have to fund all of academia and build up all of academia, not just science and technology. Now, in the 5 minutes or so that I have left, the second part, capacity development, again, who can argue? We need capacity development, but the problem is that we need capacity development that fits into our existing system. We tried this setting up elite institutions, again, like my own. It just doesn't work. We handle, we educate a fraction of the people. We have, no matter what we do, we can never reach out to the entire, through the entire Indian educational system. We just don't have time. We just don't have the people. And so when you build up, you have to account for the people who are already in the system, those people who have been 20 years, they've been told that all they have to do is to interact with students, perhaps give them a degree at the end, not even necessarily educate them. And now suddenly you're telling them that, no, you have to be in the front line of research. You have to propel India to the 3rd rank in the global scientific scheme. And it doesn't work. Again, all well-meaning stuff, as Dr. Krishna, LGBTQ, who can argue? Gender parity, gender equity, all of this has to be done. But you have to do it from the ground up. You have to help those people who are actually working and facilitate internationalization of R&D to foster brain gain. All right, fine, but what I've seen of the programs that they have, this Vajra, this Gyan, they're really retirement projects, or people come and they spend 6 months with visiting family. It doesn't do anything to build these long-term collaborations. There are some DST programs that do, these Indo-Japanese programs, Indo-Russian programs. These do build long-term programs, but you have to foster that. You have to you have to help those people who are actually working. And so let me just end by saying the last thing which really bothers me about this STIP policy, which is that it's a high-level policy that says we will do this, we will double the number of researchers, we will triple the amount of funding, we'll do all this, and yet we can't pay our students on time. Students don't get their funds on time. Projects are not released on time. We're told that we're subject to GFR 2017, this general financial rules. We can't buy equipment because everything has to go through GEM. So while you're saying that, yes, we'll double money, we'll double personnel, for the people who are working, I can tell you that my life today is much harder than it was 5 years ago, just because there's so many more constraints. We can't even travel to a meeting without getting permission from DST. And so these are the issues that really need to be solved. And I wish that when they had done the STIP, they, instead of just involving a bunch of people from IMSC and from wherever else they did, they had gone to the colleges, they had gone to the universities, and they had asked people, what do you need to work? You don't need a policy for that. All you really need to do is to say, okay, we'll give you more money, we'll give you a little freedom, and let's see what you can do. And so let me end there and turn it over to TVV.
Thanks a lot, Professor Jain. Now I request Dr. TVV, and after 15 minutes, and after that we can open for a discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I'll also share my screen and then start my talk. I mean, audible, visible? It's fine?
Yes.
Yeah, so let me share my screen. Give me a second. Yeah, can you tell me whether my screen is visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Yes, TVB. Go ahead.
Okay. I mean, it's something that Dr. Krishnaswamy also presented in the beginning. So quickly, let's get some idea of where we are and in what context we are talking about. So if you are talking about science spending, of course, this is showing up to 2017, and in the last 3 years, there have not been much significant different. You can see in terms of GDP expenditure, in terms of $1 billion, where is our investment in terms of money amount spent? Okay, you can look that while US, China, and European Union are over here, India is somewhere over here. Okay, much less than even South Korea and France. So if you look at as percentage of GDP, not as amount, but as percentage of GDP, still you would find that we are here, which is a little more than 0.5%. Whereas you will find China, which is aspiring to expand its science horizon, really reaching 2% and above. So without actually talking about this and discussing the importance of spending more, I think making huge plans, I'm not sure how realistic it's going to be. Okay, so let's look at, for example, this comparison. Forget about the money and so on. Let's look at the number of researchers per million. We have 137. China has 1071. Okay, this is the number of personnel engaged per million. For every million, we have about 137 people who are engaged in various aspects, which is broadly called as science and technology work, which includes, for example, many times lab technicians and others. So it's not within quote scientists with the designation scientists employed in different institutions. This is a number. If you are going to talk about increasing, are we not going to talk about increasing the number? If you are going to talk about increasing number, is it not? Does it not mean that either you are strengthening or not, rather either while strengthening various departments in universities, you are also going to establish newer institution? Where is that talk? Yeah, so that's, I think, a important question that we need to ask. In fact, if you have been very carefully listening to what's actually going on the ground, there is a talk of winding up various institutions. People are asking questions that why we need more than one institution which does work on astronomy, for example, astrophysics, right? So that's a kind of level the discussion is happening. On the other hand, in the policy, we are talking about like we need to increase our scientific personnel and then become third power and so on. Let's look at specifically these two chapters. I mean, in this chapter, first chapter, which is talking about open science, there is this two important aspect that has been talked about. Let's like a national STI observatory and Indian Science and Technology Archive. As Dr. Jayant pointed out, the archives exist in various areas, but it's also important to ensure that different disciplines, different institutions also create that archive. So in that sense, I think it's a very positive thing to put in policy and then follow it up. Krishnaswamy mentioned that there is no place where things are kept together, like, for example, the observatory. That's not true. This is an initiative which has begun. I won't say that it is complete. I mean, it's done. But on the other hand, this portal, India Science Technology Innovation Portal, is an attempt to bring in all this kind of information like that STA observatory that talks about in the policy. I mean, that step is being taken. So I think that's also a nice one, because at one place, if things are there, more access for people will be there for information. Information asymmetry can be to an extent addressed through these kind of measures. Now coming to the next 4 sections of this first chapter, it talks about open data, open access, one nation, one subscription, and Indian journals. As regards to one nation, one subscription, I think quite a lot of discussion has taken place. It has been in the media for highlighted by media. In the context of Sci-Hub and LibGen case, this becomes important. If and when we get this kind of a one nation, one subscription system, and which means that anybody within India, within the geographical location of India, and if it is IP based, IP location based, if it is going to give access to all journals, and then that will be good. There is no doubt about it. That's one part. But let's ask some other questions. When we talk about open access, it talks about that it will provide access to all research that is happening. But when we talk about research, broadly, we can say that there are 3 components to research. Here, I'm not talking about research which are largely curiosity driven, which are about, let's say, fundamental nature of the universe, not of those, I mean, what we can call as blue sky research, where questions are asked like why the sky is blue, but research where application and so on are part and parcel of it, from medical to various other areas. Okay, so if we broadly divide the research into 3 parts, one is questions. We address certain questions, right? Then the second is the actual research, and then from that we get a perception of the research area that we are working on. Then how do we use the research? There are 3 components to it. What about the question? Here it is talking about the research and the output. It is also not talking about the utilization. So leave that aside. It's good that research and its output are open access, but what about what area is being researched? Would that come under certain kind of democratic control? That's, I think, an important question to ask. Like quite a lot of researchers have pointed out, for example, agriculture research broadly, largely is focused on big farms. But whereas huge, in terms of percentage, if you look at it, that huge number of farmers have small land holding, and particularly rain-fed. Is there research work that is happening for these farmers, for agriculture in this area? These are all questions which remain outside. So basically, what is called as undone science, science which is not done. Okay, diseases which afflict poor, diseases which afflict very small number of people. Many of these things are left undone, right? So this undone science, I think, is also an important question that we need to address. So open access is should not be only about output of research, but also what areas we are researching. I mean, that there needs to be a certain depth in that. Then there is a data issue. Of course, if you are a researcher and you have collected the data, what kind of data you will be compelled at what time? I mean, I think we need a much better clarity on that, which of course may not be in policy alone, but I think a broader understanding would be required over there. Coming to the next 4 chapters of this first chapter, first subsections of 4 subsections of the first chapter, it talks about research facilities, open educational resources, libraries, and learning spaces. So let's look at the first 2, 1.7 and 1.8. They kind of resemble the inter-university centers which were formed at one point of time, saying that universities are not able to acquire such facilities. So let's create a common facilities for various universities where faculties from these universities can come and function. If we are talking something like that, what are the areas in which we are looking at inter-university centers? What kind of facilities are we looking at? These all needs a bit of thinking. Otherwise, it seems to be a good platitude. Coming to the last part, which is, I think, very important, that is learning spaces. 1.10. Okay. When we talk about learning spaces, I mean, it's a very nice phraseology. But if you look at the history of DST used to have something called as core funding projects. So what is this core funding project? I mean, it's a basically project at a local level where a researcher from a university or institution or a group of researchers are funded to work on a specific local area problem. Like say, for example, tanning. I'm not talking about tanning industry. I'm talking about artisanal tanning. Okay, where I mean you are processing few hides, which actually provides gainful employment to a certain number of people at the local level. Okay, there were where of course the technology cannot be done in the drawing board. The technology can be developed only by interacting with the practitioners at the ground level. There are a lot of such, for example, the village level agro-industrial possibilities. If you are not looking at it purely in corporate sense, but at a local level, so that the drudgery of work can be reduced, productivity can be increased. At the same time, the large number of people will get gainful employment. There is a huge possibility, but that learning space is a learning space where the researcher, a technologist, a developer, and the artisans have to come together. Such kind of visions, I think, is missing in this policy when they talk about learning center. That's one thing that I saw. Okay. Next, coming to the next chapter. Again, for want of time, I think I'll quickly go through this. It does talk about, for example, humanities and social sciences. 2.1, the educational research, they talk about the interface between science and technology, humanities and social sciences. But what does it see the role of humanities and social sciences? It sees as a way to promote S&T department and industry. Where is that connection? It seems to be just simply thrown around together. If we are talking about connection of humanities and social sciences with science and technology, one important question would be that what does science and technology do today in the contemporary world? How does it affect common people? How it promotes equity or otherwise? You know, many of such questions are important questions, but these are missed in this policy. And when we talk about science and technology education, the focus seems to be more on school, some or other, and largely again more on what we can call as something like a cluster school innovation, where local laboratory, a CSIR laboratory will adapt to 4-5 schools. The scientists will go there and talk to the children. They're all nice. They're all good. I'm not saying that they should not be done, but they cannot be the basis on which science education can be built. Maybe many people who are listening to this program might not take my point rightly, but still I think it's necessary to point out that sometimes putting some scientists in front of children and making them talk science to children is a torture. I mean, it's a child right violation in my opinion. They are a good scientist. There is no doubt about it. But that's not their job. Talking to children is a quite different stuff. People go through teacher education to become a teacher. So it is some kind of assumption that such skills don't require any training. You know, I mean, that kind of a feeling one gets. And again, if you go to a question of, for example, national school and higher education, it talks about for children with extraordinary intellectual abilities in specific sphere of activity as a specific angle. Similarly, it is talking about as a scientific social responsibility policy, research institutions would be needed to participate in school education. Really? Sure, you should encourage scientists to do science popularization. You should encourage scientists to interact with students. There is no doubt about it. You should give space for that. You should create space for that. But the purpose of school education is to be largely driven by school teachers who are trained to interact with the students, right? So this idea of parachuting somebody like glamorously one scientist from some big lab into school, and that will change the school science. I think is a bit problematic. Similarly, it is when it talks about higher education research excellence framework, what is it talking about? It is talking about again creating, identifying certain parameters and evaluating institutions. The more the interest seems to be in ranking rather than in actually promoting people, giving them freedom. People, let the people come up with ideas and then they try to implement. There seems to be that thing which is lacking. And one thing, as a science communicator, I find bit distressing, I should say so, is that the students who are undergoing PhD will be given training in science communication. I really don't understand. If they mean by science communication here, it's about writing papers in journals, yes, or communicating your research, yes, I have no problems. Of course, you need that kind of a training. But if you're talking about the science communication in terms of explaining your work to ordinary people, again, if that particular individual has an interest, inclination, you should give that opportunity. But enforcing that every scientist will do this, I think is overkilling, overdoing, slightly childish, in my opinion. I think one thing I also found interesting, which I think is a good point in the policy, is this skill building through hands-on training, that it is talking about academic institutions, students from academic institution interacting with the MSME, trying to address locally relevant issues. There have been lots of experiments in this country, like how the students, engineering students, project work can be linked to some local issues, and then so that the students also actually understand the society in which they are going to become engineers and so on. So from that point of view, I think this particular point which has been put here, if that is implemented, if there is a particular systematic effort to implement that, is I think a welcome. Similarly, they are talking about a teaching learning center, which will be created to upskill the faculty members. I suppose when they are talking about faculty members here, they are talking about faculty members of colleges and higher education institution. Yes, I think such a thing where they are also talking about pedagogic research and so on is essential. With increasingly first generation learners coming to our higher education institute, the way of teaching, I think needs a huge change. Such research-based, science-based policy making, teaching, and creating a teaching learner center, I think is also a good initiative, which I see in this two chapters. With that, I think I'll stop my presentation. I suppose we should open up for discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. TV. Now let us open up for discussions. And initially, there are few questions. From that, we will start with that. And then we will open up for others also to ask questions. Those who are joined in Zoom, they can directly ask questions after this. The one question came across is, which you have also already pointed out, Dr. TVV, is one nation, one subscription. You have talked about that. The question is one nation, one subscription a remedy or a solution? Should it be part of a policy? And then associated, there is other question on the open science and open access. What about funding academies and institutions in India which are running journals right now, and to ask them to open up completely with open access? And the associated third question is, what about policy on those who are taking part in reviews and being editors in paywall journals? The question is to both Dr. TVV and Professor Jain.
See, this common subscription, I mean, this one nation, one subscription is a new coinage, but trying to give a common subscription to, let's say, all the scientific institution under the ministry was something that was initiated quite some time ago, but didn't go through actually. Through Knowledge Network, there was an effort to get one subscription for all the scientific ministries and institutions and so on. One of the major problem they found at the time is that the publishers were not willing to give that. So I don't know what is going to happen when they go with this kind of idea to negotiate with publishers. But whatever be that, ultimately, as far as I am concerned, that if actually the papers are available freely, accessible to anyone, let's say at least within Indian context. Of course, I would rather really want it internationally. But the policy in India can talk only about policy in India. So from that angle, that if anybody in India wants to access a paper that is freely available, I'm happy. Certainly, there is no doubt about that.
I think TVB may remember that I was chairman of a committee in, I think, 2011
Yeah.
that was one nation, one publication. I mean, whatever, one set up by Dr. Kasturirangan.
Yeah.
And we recommended this, and this was a decade ago.
And this Mahesh in Niskar was also trying to push it very hard, trying to work out something, but things didn't actually take off finally.
I think there was one other question on why researchers are refereeing papers and so on. And all I can say is that we in this system. And I do think that it does have to change. We are in a system where publishers make a lot of money off of the hard work of scientists who don't get enough benefit from them. I mean, you know, the benefit is one-sided. It does have to change. But at the same time, in astronomy, for instance, our journals are society-driven journals. They're not for-profit publishers. They're driven by the societies. There's one size fits all. It's a difficult thing. We have to look to specifics. And I can't tell someone their student needs to graduate. The student needs to get a job. I can't tell that student, don't publish in a paper, in a journal that will get you a job later on. It's an ecosystem, and that whole ecosystem has to be fixed. We can't go addressing single parts of it.
Thank you. Any other questions from audience?
May I speak?
Yeah, please.
Is there any connection between the NEP and the STIP? Dr. Krishnaswamy was able to explain the connection between the NEP and the STIP. The STIP says that we will become the world third rank in the S&T, but in the NEP under national research funding, and they are restricting postdoctorals in given numbers, like 500 postdoctoral research, 500 doctoral research. If such is a restriction for researchers, how can we become the third nation in the science and technology?
No, I think there does have to be, again, this is one of my problems with STIP. I do think that there will be a lot of problems that I see people say that extramural projects won't allow you to pay journal charges. People in colleges don't have journal charges. They're not allowed to go to meetings, or they're not able to go to meetings. A lot of things that do have to be solved, and they have to be solved from the ground up. And by the way, I agree strongly with what TVB said. It's often torture to listen to people who don't know how to communicate their results. I think, forget students, I think we've all been through that.
Any other questions? Thanks. If there are no other questions, shall I hand over this to Sean?
Yeah, Siddharth. So I mean, I was just telling.
Can you make one
Thanks,
comment?
Dr.
No
Yes.
question. Can you make one comment before we?
Yeah, please, Dr.
Okay, I think the inclusion is a very important aspect when we talk about science and technology. Inclusion in the sense that people who would get access to higher education like a PhD and so on, so who can become potentially future scientists. I mean, I'm talking about from that angle, only in that angle. I'm not talking about at undergraduate level or even at postgraduate level or school level. I'm talking only about that niche part of it. If you look at the earlier scheme of the where the students were picked up from every district, that is every district, 2 students were picked up, one male, one woman, whoever is the school topper in the local school, local educational board. Which essentially means that we have something about 600 districts. So you are talking about some 2,400 to about, sometimes the numbers were more, so about 5,000 people and so on. This kind of picking up from different parts of the country is essential. Otherwise, what's happening is that people in different geographical location, and this also brings in variety. I mean, people with different social background, different cultural backgrounds, and so on also into. The schemes which are getting again and again into some kind of a national competition, I think some or other we need to get out of it. Some or other we need a mechanism whereby selection process itself is able to pick people from different parts of the country, from different backgrounds. That is one, I think, if we really want to have a good inclusion, and if really the Indian science needs to build its trust to the populace, I think this will be required. Second, the whole ISs were established with the understanding that there may be certain number of ISs, maybe 15, 20 or something like that. And all the students who are getting enrolled in this ISS would be paid some minimal scholarship for this course, so that people with poor ability to pay and so on also will be willing to come and join. But recently we are seeing that that's getting restricted, and only a small section is being paid. I think we need to look at all these issues also part of this policy framework.
Thanks a lot, Dr. TVV. And thanks a lot, Professor Jayant and both Dr. TVV for your excellent views. Now I'll hand over this session to Sean.
So Siddharth, I was just thinking, like, if others also have opinions, not questions, on this, we can provide 5 to 6 minutes for them to raise. Yeah. After that, we can close on the session.
Sure. So if any views, please.
Yeah. Hello.
Yes.
Yes, Siddharth, you can go ahead. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please hear your opinion. Yeah.
I would like to ask clarification on one of the points in the chapter on capacity building, and I would like to hear from both TVV and Professor Jayanmurthy on this. Like, there's a certain point which says that studies will be conducted to analyze and forecast the sectors of demand and scope of career building for PhDs and postdocs to establish a complete mechanisms. So it says that somehow when I read this point, it looks like, in which area that I am interested to do a PhD, it would be like, there'll be certain set of areas which is prior identified, like pre-identified areas. Won't it be like hampering the research, like basic research in science that happens? Like, I'd like to hear from both the discussions on this. What do you think? This is something which we should be like criticizing, this point, specific point.
I think what you say is very important, and this is part of what I think the message we've been getting for the last several years is that, yes, we do have to do directed research, we have to connect with stakeholders, and for those who, I believe that there should be a very broad foundation, that it's only when you have a broad foundation that you get those specific areas addressed. And to direct people into specific areas, even if those are scientifically valid, is I think dangerous. So that I do think that statement is very dangerous, but I do think also that it fits in with the philosophy of the last few years. I mean, not even just this government, but since maybe over the last decade.
See, I think this point of utility, I think is being ridiculously extended. When we talk about training, let's say PhD student, in my view, the training gives that person how to analyze, how to do research. It's not about the area in that person that has done research and the output that has come out of that research. I think this is being missed by people. So if I am a teacher and I'm going to take a student, I would choose a problem that the student would be able to do, not necessarily the problem that has a great bearing on, let's say, if that happens, I'm very happy. But to insist that it should have that kind of a utility, then would essentially impair both the teaching learning and training the students to think on her or his feet. So the very idea of why a PhD student does a research, I think people are missing who are talking about this kind of stuff.
Any other opinion from others? Anyone? If there are no views, shall we close this session? Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can close, Siddharth, if
Yes,
there are
yes,
no more.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I
So,
thank both panelists and I'll hand over this to Sean.
okay, thank you, Siddharth. Thank you, Professor Jain Murthy and TVV. So the next section is on research, innovation, and entrepreneurship. I will hand it over to Ananda. Ananda, you can take over.
Yeah, I will share my screen first. Let me know once you can see the screen. Is the screen
Not
visible
yet.
now?
Not yet, Ananda.
Okay, one moment. Just a moment.
Yes, it's visible now.
Okay. Okay, good evening, everyone. This is Ananda here. I'll be moderating this session on the topic Research, Innovation and Entrepreneurship under the Science and Technology Innovation Policy 2020. So under these two subtopics, I have listed down the major points which our panelists will go through. So under research, the priority issues that are identified are expanding the science and technology system through identifying areas of social importance or the areas of disruptive potential from the Indian perspective, then running mission mode programs, and also they discuss a lot about collaboration with the industry. And the next priority issue is enhancing the quality of research. For this, the policy proposes expanding the talent pool through joint appointments in government, industry, and academia, and also promoting mentoring and incentives for the researchers, developing and reorienting research culture, and establishing guidelines for safety protocols. Then they talk about engaged research, where they want to address plurality of solutions for different region or different socioeconomic strata, and they want to create a function which can promote publicly funded research to all stakeholders, basically to improve the visibility of all these projects that are running by the Indian government. Then the last point is improving the ease of doing research. Here they talk about creating digital platforms for managing the grants, and they also touch upon open data and open access policy. Coming to innovation and entrepreneurship, they talk about strengthening innovation ecosystem, for which they want to create interlinkages between various stakeholders. They would like to set up technology parks and innovation clusters and theme-based virtual incubators and accelerators. And they also have points related to gender inclusion and setting up of sector-specific innovation. For enabling entrepreneurship, They would like to invest in physical and social infrastructure, promote entrepreneurship education programs throughout the country, nurturing the startups, and streamlining the regulatory regimes, also creating centralized database on all forms of financial incentives that are available for research. Finally, they also talk about grassroots innovation and traditional knowledge system, where they would like to curate, preserve, and maintain the traditional knowledge, support grassroots innovators, and also establish technology parks for them, and also identify new funding mechanisms. There is also a point regarding encouraging innovations in specific sectors like agriculture, water, and energy. So these are the major points that are covered under these two sections. Now I would like to invite the panelist today for this session, which is Dr. Ajit, who is a technologist and entrepreneur. He has a PhD in computational neuroscience, and currently he is running a company called Ongil Limited, which works on data management. Our other panelist is Professor Suvrat Raju, who has done his doctorate from Harvard and is currently working at the International Center for Theoretical Sciences, which is part of TIFR. His current research is in the area of quantum gravity and quantum field theory. So now over to the panelist, and I would like to invite Dr. Ajit.
Hi, thank you very much. So given, I mean, I have very limited exposure to the research ecosystem in India, so I'll just be focusing on the innovation and entrepreneurship chapter, and I'll be speaking just about that. Yeah, so just with that, so this is the only slide I have. So this is just to point out the three different topics under which this document is put up. One is, let's say, the strengthening the innovation ecosystem. The second one is they talk about fostering science and technology enabled entrepreneurship. And finally, they want to they talk about integrating grassroots innovation with the research and innovation ecosystem. So first, let's say, at a high level, the document, as the previous speakers have mentioned, they talk a lot about, let's say, inclusion, diversity, and holistic development without actually meaning anything, in the sense that nothing tangible comes out of it. And also, I should just add, like from a purely stylistic point of view, the document, I don't think the document is well written at all. It keeps jumping from the specifics to high-level vision on alternatively. For example, in one particular statement, they go very deep dive into a particular sector called medicinal plants, and then they come back and talk about the entire science and technology sector as a whole. So I don't know how much clarity, and I mean, the document is not very, I mean, does not give a lot of clarity in that sense. Like before diving into the document, I've just to kind of lay down a few fundamental points. When it comes to, let's say, entrepreneurship, and also, let's say, fostering innovation and bringing on innovation entrepreneurship together, there are like two major aspects. One is the economic aspect, let's say the entrepreneurship or the innovation, they are to operate within a certain economic system and an environment. The second is the social aspect. Let's say which section gets access to what, and what are the existing social setups that constrain or allow innovation and entrepreneurship to happen. So while these two are not fully unrelated, I'd like to take them one by one. So first, in the document, the only place where the economic context is taken into account is only the following statement that they make. They talk about, so just a minute. So I just, yeah. So they talk about like investing in basic foundational and reliable physical and social infrastructure for S&T enabled entrepreneurship to thrive. This includes investment in key infrastructure in, let's say, scientific R&D laboratories, hospitals, ICT. I mean, first of all, like, I think it's good of them to recognize this point, but there is much more to the economic environment beyond, I think, where the document goes to. For example, let's say, as all of you might have already known, like, since this document talks a lot about startups, if you take, let's say, the top 10 most valued startups, most of them, I mean, at least half of them are from the US, the remaining are from China. There is one Indian startup whose name keeps popping up, and it is backed by a Chinese venture firm. So why is this? I mean, one is, of course, one could talk about innovation and so on. The other thing that we'll have to recognize is, I mean, all the Chinese companies who sell purely in the Chinese market, they are not even known. The company names are not even widely known, let's say, like an Uber or a Stripe or any other startup outside the Chinese market itself. But the market there itself is so huge, and people have the money to buy things, or let's say the software or the services these companies provide. And also there are like industries who are willing to purchase and who have the wherewithal to kind of consume these products. So this is like, first of all, like it's very, very important. And therefore it is very important to keep in mind that what applies for one country cannot necessarily be translated into another. I mean, like simply to be, like taken and fit into other countries. So because the markets are fundamentally different. So this is one aspect. The second aspect is like, if we take, like the point is, while the government incentives and interventions are absolutely essential for, let's say, in this area of innovation and entrepreneurship, the economy, if you like it or not, plays a more important role. So a draft which kind of considered this, kind of builds up an entire idea around innovation and research, innovation and entrepreneurship, without taking this into factor, is almost, it's like built in a vacuum. For example, they talk about like factors like, for one of the statements that they make is, so this just next sentence. They also talk about promoting entrepreneurship education programs across the country by involving local communities, and that is schools, higher education institutions, non-profit organizations, scientists, entrepreneurs, and other stakeholders. Basically, everyone and anyone like who wants to who's under the sky. So, but the point being that, like they talk of, let's say, fostering entrepreneurship continuously, and entrepreneurship as a kind of a like, for example, empowerment, developing startup culture, developing, let's say, developing risk-free environment, and so on and so forth. These kind of words fill up the document. But what they don't even mention is already 51% of India's workforce is self-employed, and approximately 25% of them, like almost 70 to 75% of them, like work on their own, but 25% of them at least already employ someone else. Now, this could be someone from their family members, and around 5% of them employ someone outside their own families and pay them. So it's not like the government has to go and, let's say, foster the spirit of entrepreneurship that is somehow lacking in the country. And that is what the document makes it sound like, as though, let's say, the country is not known for its innovation and entrepreneurship, and the government has to foster this feeling. It doesn't talk about, let's say, empowering or, let's say, enabling the existing entrepreneurs in this country. It just directly takes this top-down approach where it automatically talks about startups, AI. I'll go through, let's say, how they've used it in completing nonsensical sentences, if I can say so, where they talk about, let's say, AI and so on. But let's say, I can just, if you see the document, the last line, literally the last line is dedicated to the fact that research efforts will be encouraged for developing cost-effective technologies and encourage grassroots innovation to reduce drudgery, address the scarcity of farm labor, and improve efficiency in sectors like agriculture, water, and energy. This is exactly the last line. And as we just spoke of, as we just discussed, this is like more than 50% of India's population work on sectors like this. And there is very, very little focus on reducing their drudgery. There is nothing specific about, let's say, addressing the problems that they are going through, and absolutely nothing on that aspect. And even when it comes to, let's say, startups, like how specific is the document? Now, for example, let's say, there are already efforts to kind of like foster startup culture in India, like since the past 5 years, like when in 2015, the Startup India scheme was launched. Now, the Startup India scheme has been running a lot of webinars and a lot of events and so on and so forth. But they also, like, a lot of these points that they mentioned here about bringing together a single source where, let's say, all the incentives and opportunities, financial opportunities available for startups will be put together in one place, is what they speak of. This question is already a mandate of Startup India. And Startup India is not like fully like satisfying the role that is given to them. So without any basis, as Dr. Krishnaswamy mentioned earlier, without taking into account what the status quo is, what is the current status is, the document goes into repeating whatever has been the mandates for other organizations. So, like Startup India scheme and so on and so forth, and they make they have minimal understanding of like what is even currently happening in the innovation space. And also, like, regarding innovation, there has been a lot of innovation already by universities and already by let's say by existing organizations. For example, like they talk of like innovations in agriculture in more than one place, but they don't mention what is the current status quo in terms of like what is it the current institutions are doing, and how will this differ from like what these current institutions are doing. Is it going to enable these current institutions, or let's say is it going to set up a parallel system? So nothing is seen. For example, I know that Tamil Nadu Agriculture University, for example, uses Sentinel data, which is a satellite from the European Union, to estimate paddy yield. Now, this is the same activity that is being done by a lot of private companies in, let's say, the US, for instance, where they estimate wheat yield and so on. Now, the point is, let's say, if this information or like this existing setup to estimate a certain yield is not used, and you're just going to foster innovation from startups to carry out the same work, is it not wasteful? I think that is what like they kind of focus on. Now, as I mentioned, right, I mean, there are also like a few points which are like, for example, they keep talking about industry startup collaboration. Now, industry academia collaboration. For example, while that is definitely needed, no doubt, the efforts till now, I mean, whatever we have been exposed to, let's say from a startup angle, is that when we meet like academicians, I mean, I'm not blaming them, but this is exactly the gap. They have solutions which are in need of problems, but startups, they have a problem for which a solution is needed, but unfortunately, they don't always merge together one-to-one, because like the problem the startups or let's say the industry faces is very, very specific, and the solution that like the existing academic setup has like is very general. So to bring them together is not easy. Like, I mean, for example, I have been part of the Singapore ecosystem where they have been trying to do this. And what I've noticed is it just puts unnecessary pressure on the, I would say like the academicians to go out of the way to somehow manufacture a commercial utility for the research that they do. And this just raises and what I also observed is this just raises the pressure within the academia without yielding anything tangible, even for the industry. Forget like academic suffers and so on. Even for the industry, it is not very useful at all. In fact, like they have a separate department where they employ people specifically for this, but it takes them nowhere in this particular context. But of course, there are a lot of other things that Singapore does. Right? Now, what is actually needed is, let's say, I mean, all this, beyond all this, let's say industry, academia, collaboration, and fostering innovation through it, what we need is actually a strong university system where we can get, let's say, a lot of talents from, who can work for like these innovative startups or companies, or who can do their own innovation. And that is what is needed. And an ecosystem where, let's say, which values innovation, rather than these specific points, let's say, when these linkages are forced to happen and nothing comes out of it. In fact, just recently, we have tried to work with a very well-renowned science institution, but we couldn't simply speak to each other because the languages were totally different. So you can't simply force it to different fields and hope something comes out of it. And finally, let's say, as I said, right, I mean, the document has some really, meaningless statements. For example, just note this, advanced tools based on machine learning and AI will be used for curation, preservation, maintenance of heritage knowledge. I mean, what do they even mean by this? Scientific and technological collaborations of the Ministry of Culture will be for recreating, maintaining the heritage and traditional knowledge system. So, for example, it's like they are force-fitting words like machine learning and AI totally out of context into things that we know nothing about, and then they hope something comes out of it. I mean, this I think encapsulates what this document is all about, where it is a mishmash of different thoughts put together without anything particularly useful. I mean, there are a lot of good intentions shown here and there about inclusivity, about inclusion, about, let's say, making the entrepreneurship system diverse and providing fellowships and so on and so forth. But nothing tangible comes out of this entire thing. And they take, as Dr. Krishnaswamy also pointed out earlier, they keep talking about grassroots innovation and so on, but they never define what grassroots is. I mean, as I just mentioned earlier, more than 50% of India's population is self-employed. Do they mean, let's say, someone who owns a cart and sells fruits, grassroots? Do they mean innovation in that? Or do they mean just, let's say, something like Ayurveda or some such thing? This we do not know. Nothing in this document, at least in this chapter, doesn't talk about it. And finally, let's say, if I have to make some specific suggestions, I mean, I do not know whether it will be even implemented. There are like a few things that the document can include, to make it somewhat more relevant. For example, the area, especially from a startup angle, which is what I'm very familiar with, what this document talks about is like continuous support, right from ideation to actually building and scaling a company. But where, let's say, most of the funding currently lacks is in the ideation stage. That is, let's say, when someone wants to start a company, that person has to go around, decide on an idea, look at what problem that person is going to solve, and look at what the status of the industry is, who is the competition, so on. This takes a long time. Now, the problem is, like, there is no support system in place for it. Now, with all these funds that they are creating, if they can award some fellowships, which will encourage people across different social strata to be able to do this, because right now it requires a lot of privilege to be able to do this, because you need to have finances ready for 1 year. You need to kind of make sure your family is supportive. So which means people only from a certain social and economic strata are able to come forward. Now, on the other hand, I'm not saying this is going to solve all the problems, but at least a step in the right direction would be to award such fellowships. Now, the second thing is, like, as I mentioned, one of the key problems, let's say, for what is called business to business startups, is like Indian corporations. It could be a very general statement, but the truth is, like, they are extremely innovation averse, because the Indian economic system or whatever, like, has no incentives for them to innovate. Now, what this means is, let's say, startups who want to sell to businesses have to look for markets outside India. Now, this is a major challenge. And especially, let's say, company working in India, they have to go to the US. Now, this is an unthinkable thing. Now, if the government can actually do something concrete there, which enable, let's say, small startups to set up or, let's say, land abroad, then it kind of land, let's say, markets and outside India to kind of grow their business, especially the startups. I don't talk about the big companies. Then this will be very, very useful. The other thing is, let's say, like governments like Singapore, for example, they pay interns to work in startups. I mean, they kind of reimburse 75% of the salary. Now, if they can do something similar in India, where they kind of pay the interns to work with startups and startups can reimburse, I mean, like the government can reimburse a certain amount of salary, that could also like foster this collaboration. So, but just to summarize this thing, I think at a high level, I mean, the document is at a very high level, jumping to specifics here and there, a lot of useless or like less meaningful words thrown around. And I think it has to be a bit more concrete before like one kind of welcomes the initiative or even like offer something concrete in return. Yeah, that's it from me. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Ajit. Is there any questions that we have to take up, or can we move to Professor Subrat, and later we can have a joint discussion?
Yeah, later we can have another.
Okay. Okay. Then over to me, Professor Subrat.
Okay. Can you all hear me clearly?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, fine. Okay. Thank you very much, for asking me and inviting me to be part of this discussion. I've been hearing the discussion so far, and it's been very interesting to hear what other people had to say. Even when this STIP draft was first released, and of course when the invitation for the discussion came, I've tried multiple times to look through this draft and read through the draft. And as many panelists earlier also said, there are many things which are lacking in the draft. If you look a little more closely at the draft, I think the outstanding quality of this STIP draft is not that it's bad, but that it's basically, I'm sorry to say, but basically just full of platitudes. So it's not even possible in many cases to even criticize it coherently, because in many places the draft policy just doesn't say anything except for just articulate a bunch of platitudes. I mean, in the section on research, if you just look at the first couple of paragraphs, I think this illustrates what I'm saying. It says India should emerge as a globally competitive country in strategic fields of research while simultaneously focusing on unaddressed and underaddressed nationally important problems. A special emphasis on R&D activities will address the current weaknesses in Indian research and ensure strengthening of key areas relevant for the well-being and prosperity. India should focus on mission mode programs in priority sectors with technology and innovation deliverables built on a strong foundation of basic science, ensure research is fit for purpose, enhance the quality of research, and also increase the ease of doing research. I mean, no one would disagree with anything here, but if you just take a step back and think about what I said, I basically didn't say anything. Sure, we should, or these sentences which I was reading out from the policy, I mean, sure, we should enhance the quality of research, we should increase the ease of doing research. These are things that don't require a policy to say. And so it seems to me that the outstanding quality of the policy is that it's just full of platitudes. And then I was thinking about, why it is that the policy is so full of platitudes, and why it is that the policy fails to say something meaningful in many cases. It does say some things, and I'll criticize some specific aspects. But as I said, the large part is that it doesn't say anything meaningful. And I was thinking about why that is the case. And I came up, there are many answers one could give. Is the fact that you have, bureaucrats who maybe weren't thinking so much, or, they just wanted to write a policy and so on. But I thought that there is perhaps a deeper reason why the policy is full of platitudes. And let me try and explain what I think the deeper problem in this policy is. I think the deeper problem in the policy, and I think this is not only a problem with this policy, but it's a problem with many other policies that that are made of this kind, is that the policy is looking for what one might call arbitrage, in that it's looking for something that's wrong in the current system that you can fix without inconveniencing anybody or without accepting any problems or without recognizing anything that needs to be changed, where somebody who's privileged will have to give up some level of privilege. And that is, that's what one in economics sometimes calls arbitrage, where there's just profit to be made for free. And indeed, many times in systems there is some amount of arbitrage. There is some low-hanging fruit that you can pick up. As Jayant was saying, maybe there are some policies which restrict people from having international participants, and those are just meaningless, and you could just get rid of those, and that's just arbitrage. It wouldn't hurt anyone. It's just unnecessary bureaucracy. And so there is some amount of arbitrage in the system. But I think the main issue is that when one makes policy, one has to choose priorities. One has to decide what one will weigh ahead of something else. I mean, that is the whole point of a national level policy. Often, in fact, even if one is doing like institute level administration, or one is doing administration at a smaller level, one is looking for issues of arbitrage. One is looking for, how can you fix systems in some way? But when one tries to make a national level policy, there has to be a question of setting priorities and choosing, one set of priorities over another set of priorities. And that at some point, requires some level of identifying and resolving what one might call conflicts or competing priorities. And because the policy doesn't want to do that, or doesn't want to address anywhere a competing priority, or doesn't want to resolve any conflicts, or doesn't want to face up to the fact that there are problems, because it doesn't want to do that, it just ends up, mouthing platitudes. Let me give you an example of the kind of thing I'm saying. All of us say that, there should be more money spent in research. In fact, some of the previous panelists also said this, and everyone knows, right, that India spends not only in research, but in education. In fact, in education, the figure for a long time has been 6% of GDP, which from the time of UPA 1, in fact, 2004 has been said in 16 years, and we've not reached that figure. And so all of us say we should spend more money in research. But the point is that if you spend more money in research, you have to say what you will spend less money on. You can't just spend more money on research without reprioritizing some things in society. And I think that is what the policy completely fails to address. So for instance, one thing I feel could be reprioritized is that India has, they talk about India being third or so on somewhere in publications. India also happens to have the third largest defense budget in the world. India spends $71 billion per year on defense. I don't think much of this has to do with the security of the country. I think this could be cut down by a very significant fraction without hurting anyone's security. I think that security has to do with social issues. The fact that thousands of people have died in the current pandemic, where these billions of dollars couldn't help at all, but scientific research or public health could have helped. And I think that that is an example of a case where you say, we should spend less on defense and we should spend more on research. And one has to make these kinds of priorities. And unless one does that, there's no point of having a policy. Let me give another example, and I'll say a little bit more about this. Defense is one example which people gave, and perhaps many of you also agree with the fact that we need to, this is wasteful expenditure. There's another example, canonical example of wasteful expenditure, which used to be accounted for till about 6 or 7 years ago, which was, what the government used to call euphemistically the amount of revenue foregone, which was basically corporate welfare. Money given in terms of tax incentives or other kinds of excise duty relief to corporations and to companies. And that, till about 2013, till the Modi government changed the accounting system, was estimated to be of the order of 5 lakh crores, which at that time was of the order of $100 billion. And so that is an example of wasteful expenditure, which is money directly given to the private sector or given for private profit, which enables the kind of inequality that we have today, where there is a small section of extremely wealthy people. And if one wants to spend money on research, that money should be taken away from there. It should be taken away from private welfare and moved into research. And unless the policy faces up, these might be uncomfortable questions. It's much more uncomfortable to say, let's stop spending money on corporate welfare and let's spend it on research or on science or on, public health. It's uncomfortable, but unless we say that, there is no point in really having a meaningful policy. And so I think this is a second example of a place where there is a conflict which one could face up to, which the policy doesn't face up to. Let me give examples of more microscopic or smaller level conflicts. I think one of the serious problems in the issue of research, Jayant touched upon this a little bit, is the issue of lack of equity within Indian institutions. It's the fact that some institutions, including actually, I must admit, the institution where I work, TIFR, but other institutions are funded very generously, have facilities which are very generously granted to them. Whereas in many other places, the same facilities are not granted, and this is not even based on some transparent value judgment. It's just based on the way things have been. And so one has to address the issue of equity within research institutions. And when one addresses the issue of equity, one will have to take away the privilege of some institutions. You can't just more generously fund institutions which are not well funded without redistributing some privilege, without taking away some privilege. And that's an example of a conflict which could have been addressed. It's not even something broader about defense. It's an issue of internal equity, which again is not addressed. Let me give a third example of a case which again involves an issue of privilege and conflict, but which I think is important. I think one of the problems in the Indian system, it's a problem that can be traced back to a very faulty policy instituted by people like Homi Bhabha, is the fact that research institutions are separated from educational institutions, which is very unusual in terms of how things work in the world. And therefore, there are some attempts to address this by building new institutions like the ICERs and so on. But it's a fact that many large institutions, again, including the one where I am, are research institutions which are separated from where, we don't teach undergraduates or teach larger number of people. And the major teaching institutions where teaching is done are places where research is not done. So that's something that needs to be fixed. And when one fixes that, one will again have to take away the privileges of some research institutions where teaching is not done. And that's an example of something which could be addressed in a policy which was not addressed. So I give these as examples of cases where I feel that making reforms to the current system involves facing up to certain problems, which are not global problems, but which are problems where a certain set of people are privileged and benefit from the current system. And the policy fails to address these problems and recognize them. And that's the reason I feel it ends up mouthing a lot of platitudes. The part on research and innovation, as also the moderator pointed out, has, as far as I could see, one point which it keeps emphasizing and emphasizes again and again, which is the issue of interactions with industry, which is also what the previous speaker spoke about. My perspective differs a little bit from this, and I think it's something which is important, which we need to address. I think it has started to be taken for granted within discussions of science and technology policy in India, that having more interaction with industry, having a vibrant academia industry linkage is somehow good and is somehow necessarily the most desirable outcome. I think that this is something that needs to be problematized, and it is not necessarily the case. And it's in general a dangerous tendency that one needs to question. And the reason for that is that corporate interests do not necessarily align with social interests. Just because one has a vibrant corporate system which interacts with academia doesn't mean that that benefits people. And I think that the classic example, which is in fact the example where our science policymakers love to look up to, is the United States, where there is there is excellent linkage between academia and industry. And one has seen over the past 50 years, 70 years, in fact, again and again, that this linkage does not necessarily translate into things that are good for people. Let me give you an example. For instance, in the pharmaceutical industry, I think there are studies which show that about 85% of drugs on the US market were built with a significant component of public research. But it is not the case that public health outcomes in the United States are the best in the world. They're certainly not, as one sees in the COVID-19 pandemic, but even otherwise, healthcare outcomes, life expectancy, infant mortality in the United States is not the best in the world, even though there is excellent linkage between between public health research, between health industry research and the industry, academic health research in the industry. And that has not translated into better outcomes for the people in terms of health. It has translated into having very large pharmaceutical companies. So it has translated into massive profits for companies, but it has not translated into benefits for people. Here's another example, another example, which is a canonical example that people give, is the quantum electronics revolution, which is where people talk about startups and so on. The quantum electronics revolution, in some sense, came from the fact that at the time of the Second World War, the United States realized that, if it was to fund certain kinds of basic physics research, it would lead to benefits in defense. And then at some point, the quantum electronics revolution came out of that. Now, the quantum electronics revolution has been, has led to extreme growth in technology and huge technology and corporate ecosystem in Silicon Valley in the past 50 years. But one can ask, in the past 50 years, what has happened to real wages in the United States? And in fact, real wages in the United States have stagnated. This is a problem that people in the United States recognize, that there is a very significant problem of inequality in the United States, where, in some median household income has grown because more women have started to work. But it's a fact that the average American worker earns exactly the same as, the worker earned 60 years ago or 50 years ago. And so it's a fact that this huge growth in technology has not translated into something that's good for people. And so this idea, which is an idea that, is pushed by our own capitalists. If you go to these meetings, you have people, you have all of these large capitalists who want, more industry academia linkage. The fact that this is necessarily good for society is something that is incorrect. It is good for these companies because they get to increase their profits, but that doesn't mean it's good for people. And it's very important for us to question this tendency. Just saying we should have more industry linkage is not necessarily a good thing. It's not a good thing in other ways also. As I said, for instance, there is this issue of revenue foregone, which is corporate welfare. That's money directly taken away from research. There is the tremendous inequality that we see in society, where you have a small small section of people who have been tremendously enriched. These people want to increase their enrichment. That's why they push for policies like this. They have a huge impact on policymakers. And that is directly counterposed to the interests of most people in the country. And, that is harmful in the end to research as well. Because if most people cannot participate because, they're deprived of basic resources and, basic needs, that's harmful to research. So I think it's very important that this whole idea that interaction with industry is just a panacea and it's good in any form is something that needs to be questioned. Interaction with society is a different thing, and the document does make some token statements about interaction with society, but that's something that has to be judged democratically. If there is a research that leads to a good social outcome, that leads to something that's directly beneficial for people, which people can judge, that's something that's good and should be encouraged. But interaction with industry, if it leads to Infosys making some more money and some billionaires getting further enriched, that's not something that's good. And I think one needs to differentiate interaction with society with interaction with industry. And the document doesn't do that and keeps emphasizing on the issue of interaction with industry. And as I said, that's a dangerous tendency which we do need to question vehemently. Let me say one last thing, which I think the document doesn't really address. This is the issue of how one judges research. So, of course, one way one can judge research is in terms of interaction with industry, which, as I said, was problematic. Another way, which I said would be a good way to judge things, would be in terms of social outcomes, directly measured social outcomes. But then there is repeatedly within this document, mentions of rankings and citation impacts and so on. And I think that's another dangerous tendency which this document fails to address, which is the issue of the way research is being judged in a certain mechanistic way. And let me explain why it's a problem. Everyone recognizes that this whole scheme of trying to judge research in terms of rankings and citations is problematic. It's much more problematic than just being, being something which is not ideal. It's an open secret, for instance, which everyone who's familiar with these things knows. In many institutions, including in elite institutions in Bangalore, in the Indian Institute of Science and IITs, there are faculty members who are unqualified, who are being hired because they happen to be part of large collaborations where, and so they have large citations because the collaboration has citations. the administrators know that they're unqualified, but nevertheless hire them because it helps in increasing the rankings and the citation impact of the institution. And so you have it's an open secret that this is leading to problematic hires across in many very well-known institutions. And so I think that is one kind of a problem. But I think there is a deeper problem which ties up to issues that people discussed about journals and so on. If one starts judging outcome in terms of citations or impact factor of journal, or tries to look for mechanistic ways of judging things which the policy kind of hits at, or in terms of rankings, one necessarily ties oneself up to a certain agenda. And that agenda is an agenda which is set in leading Western countries, which again is set by the interests of capital there. And by forcing one to judge research in terms of these mechanistic ways, one therefore ties up one's research to the interests of the way research and the agendas of research that are set in leading advanced capitalist countries by the capitalist corporations there. And so I think that is something which needs to be addressed, which needs to be questioned. And if one asks questions about, for instance, the social impact of research, that is a very different measure from the measure of citations or measure of journals or impact factors. And so I think that's when we address the issue of research, that's a very important thing that we need to ask about how agendas are set, and to ensure that we can set agendas independently. Okay, so that's basically all I wanted to say. I'm sorry I don't have something very much more specific to say about the policy, because as I said, I couldn't find something very specific to say. But I do think it's important to recognize the issue of possible conflicts, and one has to, when one talks about funding or priorities, one has to realize that that might involve taking away privilege from some groups. One has to recognize that the buzzword of interaction with industry is not necessarily good. It is a shorthand for public benefits or public welfare going into private profits, increasing the profits of industry, which doesn't necessarily come down to society. We see in the US the quintessential example that this doesn't necessarily come down to society. And I think it's important that we have a way of setting agendas which is independent and not tied once again to some mechanistic models, because that leads to other problems, as I explained. Okay, so that's all I had to say. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Subrat. So now the session is open for questions. Anybody, if you want to raise any question, please go ahead. To both the panelists.
I have a question. This is Jayant here. I have a question for Ajit, which is that if this policy and the other policy which just came out, whatever it is, where they have 1.5 lakh innovations that are on a website, it sort of seems to think that all that business needs is an idea, and then somehow that will someone has some jugaad which works for something, and somehow that will work into a commercial idea. And how does industry really connect to the people? How would you do that? I don't think that just putting a bunch of innovations on a website will do anything. How would you go to the farmer and say the farmer needs a better canal? How does that happen?
Yeah, great question. So I think, so this is like, at least in the startup terminology, this is what is called a product market fit. So I have an idea. So that one way is like I build a product and then I figure out, I market the product and I hope someone buys. But this obviously is not an ideal way because it's very expensive. But because like I build a product, the market may not like it. I'll have to change a lot of things in the market. I think this is like to identify the problem statement, either you'll have to come from the industry. For example, let's say I'm a farmer myself and I recognize like these are the problems, or I know someone who is like a farmer and I recognize the problem, then I start building a solution. Or let's say I kind of engage with the farmers for some period of time. And this is why I also mentioned about this fellowship where let's say people from different social status. And so that is why like if the problem is not well defined, which is very, very, very critical. I mean, just like research, I believe, the solution part is not very hard. I mean, let's say building an app, putting together some machine learning systems together is not hard at all. But the key challenge in, let's say, running a startup or a company for that matter is to identify the problem. And here, I believe there is a skewed thing because like people from certain social and economic status come into play, I mean, like are fully there. Even if the market is available, for example, let's say if it's things related to farming, and so on and so forth. People do not know enough about this area to actually make an impact. Yes, you have these farm to fork, just continuing with the same example, there are these companies who are looking at marketing farm produce. But because that is something that people can relate to, people from these backgrounds can relate to, but you don't have necessarily a lot of innovation on the farming side. So this is really a problem. But typically, in an ideal way, one should deeply understand the problem and start building the solution. But in the real world, it rarely happens like that, because it's from a startup point of view, it's also a valuation game, in the sense like how much I'm valued. It is not necessarily how much revenue I'm making or how good my idea is or how many people will I certainly impact. It's about how I'll be valued, and it is kind of a game where, let's say, I should look valuable. It doesn't matter what my true value is. I don't know if it answers your question, but that's how, let's say, the innovation in industry works. But a far more matured industries might take a slightly different view. They might have larger budgets and, let's say, kind of a larger, I would say, number of personnel and so on who specifically focus on a problem. But there also, again, the problem is like, just like scientists are measured, I mean, people working in industries, they're also measured based on what they call the KPIs, the key performance indicators. And the key performance indicators, because of innovations are so hard to measure, they are rarely tied to innovation. They are about, let's say, increasing your sale by so much, or let's say, even let's say if it's linked to innovation, it's about bringing in certain new projects. But the actual innovation can't be quantified. So which means large industries don't necessarily bring in these new ideas of what people need in that sense. That's why they get disrupted by startups. And startups, ideally, which should disrupt in, let's say, if you take it in a theoretical sense, but given that they operate within a certain economic framework, they rarely do that. I don't know if that answers your question. That's my point.
Professor Jain, is that answer?
Yeah, that's fine. I just wanted to know the process.
Fine. So, any other questions from others? Okay, so I have a question to Professor Subrat. So he wanted that, or he suggested that there should not be any collaboration too much between the industry and the research institutes, because they might use this and make profits from here. But when we talk about industry, even the startups will come under this setup. So startups might need support from these research institutions to develop solutions. So do you want to club them separately, Professor Subrat?
Sorry, I didn't, just to clarify, I didn't say one should not have any collaborations with industry. I was saying that collaborations with industry are not automatically a good thing, because, it's a question of what the collaboration achieves. So just having a collab, like, let me give an example. The Stanford Silicon Valley ecosystem is considered the model, right? It's the model that everyone wants to emulate, where you have a world-class university and you have all of these startups and you have this huge industry that has grown around it. The question which many people in the US are asking, which we don't seem to be asking, but if you look at all the debates in the US election this time, many of those debates were about how has this system benefited people in the US. It has led to some bunch of billionaires, maybe some guy has $200 billion, which is completely obscene. But why is it necessary to keep benefiting that person, or allow somebody to get $100 billion? And not only is it not that, that's not even a zero, it's the fact that when this person has $100 billion, there are other people who suffer. So this is, you would like to actively discourage this kind of concentration of capital. And I think the point is that it's important that one discourages that. Now, when people talk about startups, I think the idea they have in mind is, you have a startup like Facebook, which grows into something which is successful, or you have a startup like Google, which grows into something that's successful. But I think these are models of what we shouldn't emulate. We don't want to have this kind of obscene concentration of capital. That's something that's socially bad. And that's what I was saying. It's not that one shouldn't have. If there is, one should have, and there are industries which might be doing other things. There are public sector industries. There might be, other, as I said, I think one should look very strongly for research which has a social impact, a directly measurable social impact. But just because the research helped a startup grow into a big company doesn't mean it's good. It might actually be socially bad. And and if you actually look at what is happening in these meetings and who is sitting in these R&D policies, it is these big capitalists in India. It is people like the founders of Infosys or the founders of Biocon, or these people who are sitting, and the reason they're pushing this is because they would like to make more money, and that's something that's bad for the rest of us. We need to object to that, and that's something which I find it doesn't happen. And I find that these people have way too much influence on policymakers, and their benefits don't align with the benefits of society. That's all I was saying. It's not automatically true that they're our interests align. In fact, often they don't.
Okay. Thanks for the clarification, Professor Sourath.
So Abhinav seems to have a question in the chat.
Yeah, I'll just look into that. You want to respond, Dr. Ajit?
You mean for this question, Abhinav's question?
Yeah. So
Okay.
he's actually responding to you, probably.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So I think what Abhinav says is, let's say, it's very valid. He says like India's STIP document fails to place the STI environment within the context of overall economic situation of the nation. Absolutely true. And most importantly, it fails to lay out a plan to achieve economic goals through STA policy. Yeah, this is exactly what we discussed. So his question is, in this context, what impact does lack of planning, when he says, I think planning, it says like, now that we don't have a planning commission, given that India gave a planning post to 2016, will have on implementing STIP. Yeah, just to give you the context, right? The document waxes eloquent about startups, innovation, again and again. Even from a purely utilitarian perspective, right? Without getting into the details of whether, as Professor Surat Raju mentioned, if it is actually beneficial, even from a purely like a metric-based method, if you look at the total funding raised by startups on per annum, this is the total funding, by the way, this is not total revenue. It works out to something roughly around 20 billion. And this is nothing in terms of, let's say, the actual proportion to the GDP. But the focus of the document is so much about startups. Now, the other point is, let's say, for example, like areas like agriculture that we spoke about, or forgetting agriculture, where let's say technology-driven areas like information and communication technology, where innovation is supposed to be in the blood, in terms of in those companies. Even the STIP document does not even refer to them, at least in the innovation part. So this, as you can see, like this document is quite disconnected from even the economic reality. In the sense, let's say, I don't know, like information communication technology in terms of, let's say, contribution, maybe it contributes somewhere around 15 to 20% of the GDP roughly. And most of the engineering graduates, or let's say technical graduates the country produces, they go and work in this sector. But the innovation policy hardly touches this sector. It doesn't even talk about this sector. Or what does the existing big companies of the big four of India will do? The Wipro, Infosys, or let's say TCS and Cognizance of this country will do. So this is hardly spoken about. So this is how disconnected from the reality is. So there's absolutely no plan or no basis on which, let's say, it will construct or it will lead to, it kind of relates to the overall economic planning of the nation. And this is to be expected, as Abhinav was rightly pointed out. That's my thought.
Thank you, Doctor. Any other questions? Or can we move to the next session? Shan, shall we move to the next session then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Anantha.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Dr. Ajit, and thanks a lot, Professor Surat. Thanks for the enlightening session.
Oh, okay. Ravinder, you can take over the session. Ravinder.
Yes.
I think you're on.
Is it audible?
Yeah, now it's audible. Right. Okay.
Okay, great. So, hello. I welcome you all to this session on science communication and public engagement. Before inviting our panelists to speak, I will give a brief overview of this chapter. So for a change, this chapter begins with a guiding principle enshrined in our constitution, which states that development of scientific temper, humanism, and spirit of inquiry is fundamental duty of every citizen. And then they also recognize the existing communication gap between the science and society and acknowledge the need to address social problems using science, technology, and innovation. For science communications, TIP has outlined 4 areas of priorities. They are capacity building, research, outreach, and mainstreaming the science communication. Now, capacity building aims to set up creative and cross-disciplinary platform for science communication. It wants to introduce science communication courses and skill set at school and college levels, setting up community and regional science centers, building infrastructures for conducting workshop, internship, and online courses. And it also wants to provide public access to sources and materials related to the science communication. The second area of priority is to encourage cross-disciplinary research on science communication by initiating national programs, research grants, fellowship, and positions. It also wants to conduct research on selected themes like critical thinking, countering misinformation, promoting scientific temper, and evaluation of science communications. Efforts to make science teaching more effective by incorporating the history and philosophy of science, scientific method, and critical thinking in science curriculum. Another aim is to explore new ways of disseminating scientific knowledge by folk art, theater, dance, poetry, comedy, community radio, and interactive digital platform. The third aspect of science communication policy is the outreach, under which the science and researchers will be incentivized for undertaking outreach efforts. Institutes and organizations have to allocate certain funds for science communication and science engagement activities. And it also says that NGOs and other civil society group will be involved to support science communication and citizen science projects. The fourth aspect is mainstreaming the science communication. And this they plan to do by starting a national movement to popularize science and making science an attractive career option for youngsters. Every publicly funded institution and department will have to have a dedicated wing set up for science communication and science engagement in STI related activities. And it also has a aim to promote public and private partnership for funding science outreach activities. Now, there is a lot that is being put on the paper without clear framework and blueprint for implementations. Now, formulating a policy is one step, but the moot question is, how can such a policy be implemented fair and square without political interference and imposition from top? The most worrying factor is the social ecosystem that is made right now nearly dysfunctional and divisive. So who do the science communication cater to? Who are the stakeholders? So our experience in recent years does not really inspire much confidence in whatever is being written. Today we have two experts in our panel to basically deliberate on various nitty-gritties of science communication and public engagement vis-a-vis with STIP 2020. Both panelists have several decades of experience and association with people's science movement across India. So our first speaker is Gauhar Raza. Gauhar is a well-known Urdu poet, a scientist, social activist, and a documentary filmmaker. He was formerly associated with CSIR, NISCARE, and NISTAD in New Delhi. Gauhar is also a curator and science educator. He has conducted several surveys and worked extensively on the issue of public understanding of science. So now I may call upon Gauhar to speak on the topic for about 12 to 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Am I audible? Is it okay, or I need to do something?
No, it's perfectly audible.
It's perfectly all right.
Yes.
Thank you for inviting me to share some of my ideas on this important document. I think any document, science policy document, is quite important for the country. And therefore it should be discussed threadbare, and it should be criticized for what it has omitted, or whatever has been committed in that document. Once I started looking at this document, which talks about science, technology, and innovation, then one gets an idea that it's full of beautiful words. Here and there, you talk about scientific temper. You talk about constitutional duties and what has happened in the past. So ultimately, these good words, in my opinion, at many places are extremely contradictory, and one has probably cut and paste a lot of things from other documents which do not gel with each other. There is a tendency to look for the moon and promise moon to Indian nation, which is a major problem. Any policy document has to be aspirational, and therefore there is no problem in looking at any document from that perspective. But the inspirations that a document carries and points out and leads to a path that needs to be taken by generations to come has to be realistic and not contradictory. And therefore, from that perspective, if you look at this document, I think that if I go back to SPR, Science Policy Resolution of 1958, that I would consider to be a much better document on science policy as compared to the present day document. I've been asked to talk about only the science communication chapter of this document, so I'll restrict myself to 1 or 2 points. And let me also apologize that at 8:50 or so, I would be leaving because I have other commitment, which I can't wriggle out of. So let me make 1 or 2 comments as far as this chapter, which very eloquently Ravinder talked about and summed up all the points that have been raised there. Professor Suvrat, I happened to hear his presentation, and I was very happy that he used this word repeatedly, that there is a very mechanistic understanding of both science, society, and what is happening in India and what has been happening in India. And I have the exact same feeling when this document is talking about science communication. It's not only a mechanistic understanding of science communication or science itself, but it has a model that has been rejected long ago after a lot of debate during the past 20, 30 years. In 80s, this model was identified, proposed, debated, and most of the people accepted initially as model of science communication, but very soon people realized and designated it as deficit model of communication of science, which assumes that there is a pool of knowledge and institutions of science and technology are repository of this knowledge. And on the other hand, there is deficit of this knowledge among the people, which also assume that people's structure of thought are clean slate. And the only problem lies with the communication channel. I will come back to communication channel as well, what they are doing in India. But this understanding was found to be faulty by intellectuals across the world. In India, we have been pointing out that this understanding is wrong, and therefore there is there has been a major failure in communicating science in the country. We have to shift away from this model, and this document reinforces the same model of science communication. Therefore, those who have written, those who are architects of this particular document, in my opinion, while rehashing the old documents and using the same good words here and there, interspersing them with cyber technology jargons, have not even looked at the debate that is going on in the international arena. There is an example of Eurobarometer, and people talked about it a lot. There is plethora of literature. There is this model which was adopted in the United States of America, Korea, Japan, and there is another model which was adopted and remodeled gradually in China. That experiment has not been taken into account at all. So from international literature, it is not informed. This document is absolutely not informed from latest international either debate or the developments and experiments that have been conducted elsewhere. In India also, science communication has three major players. One is media, the newspaper, the channels, etc., etc. The other is institutions built by the government. One of the institutions that you just now introduced me as part of those institutions formerly have been dissolved day before yesterday on 14th, and new institutions, two institutions where I work, have been merged and a new institution has been created. A government that cannot create new institutions is merging and trying to create new institutions. It's almost like renaming Allahabad as Prayagraj or something. So that this is how this government is operating. Personally speaking, I do not have any confidence on this government. A government that has a large number of political leaders who have been propagating and indulging in anti-science propaganda cannot be expected to produce a document, and we should have confidence on them that they will implement whatever good is there in this document. So that is also gone. The confidence, the trust is completely gone. So when they are saying that they'll hold conferences for propagation of science communication, I don't think that a minister who says that he does not believe in Darwinism will come to such a conference and deliver a lecture which will pave the way for a better communication of science and technology, or a chief minister or a judge will come to these important meetings. So what I'm trying to say is that there is an environment that has been created by the political leadership and political leaders who are sitting in very, very important places, including the Prime Minister, would abide by any of the promises that are being made here, which we may agree with. They would like to probably, this political leadership would like to probably subvert its own document wherever it stands by science and science communication, or wants to improve the consciousness of the people, scientific consciousness of the people, or scientific temper of the people. So that is besides the point. That's a political point that I'm making, that one doesn't have confidence. But coming back to this particular document, it does not take into account what media has been doing. There's nothing on media that how anti-science communication through media can be stopped. It does not take into account and has no comment on what are the hurdles, who is anti-science in the society, what are the forces that are impeding, and which are the forces they go against science to an extent that they kill people. They kill Pansare, they kill Dabolkar, they kill Kalburgi. They go to such an extent, and therefore there's no recognition of who we are as science communicators pitted against. In my opinion, I am personally, while reading this document, am not excited at all. The jumbled good words rehashed from other documents do not convince me that this government is serious about science communication in the country. And why I consider it to be extremely important area, that because I personally believe that if the country is not scientifically tempered, and we are unable to raise the consciousness of the people, then good science cannot be done. There is no way that in a scientifically ill-tempered society, you can create islands of excellence. We have seen those islands of excellence which were created at some point of time with a lot of commitment, of scientific community and political community, both. How they have deteriorated over a period of time, how they have been assaulted by babas and the environment that has been created in the country. It does not recognize that there is a section, and a very powerful section in the country which is anti-science and which is churning day in and day out myths and superstitions. And they are very powerful. They have a nexus between, it doesn't recognize the nexus between the corporate sector, these babas, and the political leadership. Unless and until a document in today's India recognizes these hurdles, science communication has no future. I think these are the points that I wanted to make.
Thank you, Gaurji. I think you have summed up it very nicely. And we will go now to the next speaker. Our next speaker for this session is Jai Somnathan. Somnathan is a grassroots activist working with People's Science Movement since last 40 years. He was part of National Executive Committee of All India People's Science Network and Bharat Gyan Vigyan Samiti. Currently, he is Malappuram District President of Kerala Sastra Sahitya Parishad, KSSP, and he's also working as a regional coordinator of Integrated Rural Technology Center, Palghat. So may I request Jai Somnathan to speak for 10 to 12 minutes?
Okay, thank you. मेरे जैसे ग्रासरूट्स कार्यकर्ता को बुलाया इसलिए आपको धन्यवाद। बेंगलुरु साइंस इनिशिएटिव को। मेरा बात तो हिंदी में होगा, आपको समझ में आएगा मुझे उम्मीद है। आवाज पहुंच रहा है ना?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, very clear.
Okay. गौहर रजा मेरा रेस्पेक्टेड फ्रेंड है, मालूम है, बहुत अच्छे ढंग से उन्होंने बताया है। मेरा इसने ओवरऑल देखा है, मैं कुछ पॉइंट्स, एक तो मुख्य रूप में इसका जो सस्ते एक ट्रेडिशनल नॉलेज के बारे में जो उसके जो एग्जीक्यूटिव समरी में बोल रहे, ये क्या ट्रेडिशनल नॉलेज ज्योतिष होगा या ये जो ट्रेडिशनल नॉलेज कितना साइंटिफिक होगा, इसके बारे में कैसे टेस्टिंग कैसे करेंगे। ये ट्रेडिशनल नॉलेज का हमारा जो वैज्ञानिक परंपराएं हैं, जैसे ही एक्चुअल सच्चाई से जो वैज्ञानिक परंपरा भारत का वो एड्रेस करेंगे या ट्रेडिशनल नॉलेज के बारे में क्या कैसे करेंगे, इसके बारे में थोड़ा एक क्वेश्चन है। दूसरा है ये मुख्य रूप में ये साइंस टेक्नोलॉजी इनोवेशन पॉलिसी जो बाहर से देखने से बहुत अच्छा लगता है, ये सब कुछ ठीक ठाक देखेगा लगेगा, लेकिन इसके जो अंदर पूरा ये डाउटफुल है, जो लेंस के बीच में बहुत सारा डाउटफुल है, क्योंकि इसमें एक बात मैं कह रहा हूँ, वही एक नया संगठन के बारे में, एक वैज्ञानिक संगठन, एक साइंस ऑर्गेनाइजेशन के बारे में इसमें 8.8 4.1 में इन्होंने कहा है, ये बहुत खतरनाक है। नया अभी तो पूरा देश में कितना वैज्ञानिक संगठन है, ये साइंस ऑर्गेनाइजेशन को क्या कोई फ्रीडम दिया है? तो जो साइंटिफिक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है उसको फ्रीडम देना चाहिए। इसके अलावा नया एक साइंटिफिक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन का ये बहुत खतरनाक है, वो पूरा सरकार का एक एजेंसी होगा, ये पक्का है। उसके एक जो ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है उसको फ्रीडम के साथ काम करने का मौका देना चाहिए, क्योंकि इस बारे में अभी देखो साइंस कांग्रेस के बारे में आपको पता है, जो नोबेल जेदा जो रामकृष्णन वगैरह उन्होंने जो क्रिटिसाइज किया है, ये उसको वो सुनना चाहिए जो उन्होंने जो कहा है। दूसरा बात है जो साइंटिफिक चैम्बर, बहुत जगह साइंटिफिक चैम्बर इस्तेमाल किया है, लेकिन ये जो सरकार ने अभी तक जो किया है वो उसके बिल्कुल उल्टा है। जो मिनिस्टर्स का है, वाइस चांसलर का है स्टेटमेंट है, अभी जो इसमें जो साइंटिफिक चैम्बर लिखा बार बार कहा है, इसके बिल्कुल उल्टा है। आजकल जो हमने देखा है उसके क्या है, रेमेडी क्या है? दूसरा है जो हमारा देश में इतना ज्यादा अंधविश्वास है, रूढ़िवादी विचार है, इसका ये इसको बढ़ावा देने में बहुत पूरा देश में लगातार काफी लोग काम कर रहा है। वो रोकने के लिए क्या कर सकते हैं? इस तरह जो जादू टोना है, रूढ़िवाद है, अंधविश्वास है, उसका प्रचार प्रसार करने वालों को उसके ऊपर क्या सजा करेंगे? उसके लिए क्या पॉलिसी है? भारत में जो सही एक वैज्ञानिक परंपरा है, तो उसके आगे करने से एक नकली परंपरा को इस आगे करने का एक गुंजाइश बार बार इसमें दिखाई पड़ रहा है। सही भारत का जो वैज्ञानिक परंपराएं हैं, उसको उसके जो बेस में, बुनियाद में अगर इसके बारे में बात करेंगे तो उसका स्वागत करना चाहिए, लेकिन इसमें एक को थोड़ा डाउटफुल है। इसमें एक बात है, सरकार का बहुत सारा पॉलिसी है, इस पॉलिसी में भी पब्लिक प्राइवेट पार्टनरशिप को एक उसके बुनियाद पर है, बेस वही है, पब्लिक प्राइवेट पार्टनरशिप है। ये स्टेप का भी वही पब्लिक प्राइवेट पार्टनरशिप के बेस पर अगर लागू करेंगे वो बिल्कुल गलत है, उसको विरोध करना चाहिए, क्योंकि ये कॉरपोरेट इंटरेस्ट के कब्जे में जाएगा। ये आम आदमी को किसमें कोई पहुंच नहीं होगा, कुछ कॉरपोरेट का इंटरेस्ट में हो जाने का पूरा गुंजाइश है। हमारे देश का जो लगभग 28-30 करोड़ निरक्षर लोग हैं हमारा देश में, उनको उन लोगों को सामने रखे ये उनको लायक के पॉलिसी नहीं है। बिल्कुल ये पूरा देश का 28-30 करोड़ निरक्षर लोगों को इसके बारे में उनको कोई गुंजाइश नहीं है, उनको सामने रखकर पॉलिसी नहीं बनाया है। दूसरा है जो आम आदमी के लिए एक हम लोगों को क्या करना चाहिए, क्रिटिकल एक आम लोगों के बीच में तर्क चिंता एवं वैज्ञानिक सोच पैदा करने के लिए उसके लिए एक ये व्यापक प्रचार प्रसार करना चाहिए। उसके लिए जो पीपल्स संवाद, जनकीय संवाद, उसके माध्यम से इसके जो खतरा लोगों के बीच में पहुंचाना चाहिए, हमारे जो ऐसे लोगों को बहुत जरूरी है। बाहर से देखने में बहुत कुछ अच्छा लगता है, जैसे गौर जी ने कहा है, क्योंकि महिलाओं के ऊपर जो थर्ड जेंडर के बारे में भी मुझे लग रहा कोई एक दो जगह में बताया है, लेकिन उसमें कितना सच्चाई है, कितना उसमें कोई डाउट है। अभी एक सवाल यह है, अभी जो साइंस कम्युनिकेशन सिस्टम है उसमें क्या दिक्कत है, उसमें कोई एनालिसिस किया है, कहाँ गैप है? इसके बारे में पॉलिसी में मुझे लग रहा क्या साइंस कम्युनिकेशन अभी जो इधर है आज के सिस्टम में, इसमें क्या दिक्कत है, इसमें एक क्लियर पिक्चर नहीं है। मेरा हिसाब से इसमें जो एक सेंट्रलाइजेशन का ये सीधा वो कहा नहीं है, लेकिन ये केंद्रीकरण का एक है दिखाई पड़ रहा है इसमें में भी। तो बहुत सारा सवाल उठता है। देखिए जैसे म्यूजियम के बारे में उन्होंने कहा है, म्यूजियम वर्चुअल रियलिटी, एक्चुअल म्यूजियम उसमें हमको विरोध नहीं करना है, एक्चुअल जो एडवांस टेक्नोलॉजी और ऑगमेंटेड रियलिटी, वर्चुअल रियलिटी, वो सब स्ट्रेंथन करना ही चाहिए। लेकिन विज्ञान क्या है, विज्ञान सवाल करके उसको विज्ञान एक्टिविटी के मेथड पर ज्यादातर म्यूजियम में उस तरह होना चाहिए, क्योंकि केवल टच स्क्रीन के माध्यम से म्यूजियम, वो मुझे नहीं लग रहा उसमें बहुत ज्यादा ये सूटेबल नहीं है। क्योंकि ज्यादातर म्यूजियम आजकल हमारा देश में जो म्यूजियम है, मैंने कलकत्ता नेशनल साइंस म्यूजियम देखा था 3-4 कुछ साल पहले, वहां का जो मैं मूर्ति देखा पूरा पुरुषों का मूर्ति है, कोई महिला मूर्ति मैंने देखा नहीं। जय नेशनल साइंस म्यूजियम कलकत्ता में पूरा पुरुष का सभी लोग है, कोई महिला, हमारे देश में बहुत सारा महिला, उसमें मैं नहीं जा रहा हूँ, क्योंकि ये केवल टच स्क्रीन के माध्यम से होगा या उसमें एक्टिविटी बेस्ड रहोगे, ये सवाल है। ये कुल मिलाकर जो हमारा गांव में लोगों को, क्योंकि ये पॉलिसी गांव के लोगों को एड्रेस करना चाहिए, कि गांव में जो लोग हैं, भारत के गांव के लोगों को जो साइंटिस्ट के बीच में एक उनको जिंदगी बेहतर बनाने के लिए, उनको साइंस एंड टेक्नोलॉजी गांव के आम आदमी को, किसान को, महिलाओं को, घरेलू महिलाओं को, उनको जिंदगी बेहतर बनाने के लिए कैसे इस्तेमाल किया जाएगा, उनके लिए संवाद रखना, उसके जो एक्सपर्टाइज उनको जिंदगी में बेहतर बनाने के लिए होना चाहिए, उसके लायक एक पॉलिसी इसमें दिखाई नहीं पड़ रहा हो, इतना मुझे कहना है। बहुत धन्यवाद।
Thank you, Somnath ji. So now the session is open for discussions, questions, and comments from the audience. So please go ahead. You can unmute your audio and please ask the question. So we have Gauhar Raja, who will be leaving soon. So you can quickly ask questions if you have some for him. No? So, Gauhar ji, you want to add few more words before you go? Some more ideas as to how we can make science communication more effective, regardless of this policy, because you have lots of experience and I think it will be good to hear that.
His mic is mute.
Ravinder ji, I'm sure people are very tired. It has been a long day for everybody probably, and therefore they are not intervening. I would have just added one or two things in very short sentences, that in India, we built large infrastructure for science and technology. In India, we had a very fruitful, intense, and marvelous debate around scientific temper the moment we got freed from the British Raj.
Right.
This debate did not happen in other countries around us. Look at Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, or any of these countries, barring China. And therefore, our democracy was stable. I think there is a direct link between this debate and stable democracy. This foundation of democracy itself is being eroded because those forces which are anti-science and anti-science communication have been unleashed completely, and they are going around spreading myths, superstitions, and anti-science ideas with impunity. The only thing that is a silver lining at the moment is what we experienced during Corona crisis. There was a lot of communication of science. People are hungry for scientific information. And my survey during that period, first round of survey during that period, tells me that people completely rejected superstitions and methods that were anti-science. Instead, they adopted what solutions the scientific community, international and national scientific community had proposed. And that is a big silver lining for me. The progressive forces in the country, those who are for science and technology, have an opportunity to go to the public. I do not have any trust in this government. The only route or option left to us is to go to the public directly and try to formulate our own science and technology policy, including science communication policy. That would be a big exercise that is required right now, with intrusion of both new technologies which have come up and also the corporate sector, which has a much bigger hold, and a very powerful anti-science lobby which is operating in the country.
So Goharji, I know you have to go, but if you have 1 more minute to spare, there's a question from Sandeepan, and he wants to know, he wants you to comment on how you see the role, including the possibilities of social media in science communication. So quickly before you leave, please. Yeah.
I think the progressive groups, including science groups across the country, and those who are left of the center, have almost missed the bus. But it's not too late. We were the last to enter into the arena and use social media. I'm very happy that this is a use of social media, which we are doing at the moment. But we were late. The regressive forces were the first to use it. But their time has also tapered off. People are sick of them in the country. Now, if we make use of this media, it has great potential, in fact, to propagate science, but not the way it is documented in this particular document. Their understanding is completely wrong. We need to develop an understanding across the country, discuss it threadbare, and use the potential of new media.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So thank you very much, Goharji. I think that's very, very valuable discussion, and you could take your time, spend time with this.
Thank you very much.
So yeah, thank you so much. So we can go for some more questions from audience. So Shan, yes, go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm okay. I mean, if there are more questions, we can take.
Right. So we also have Sabyasachi Chatterjee and TBV among the audience, and they were also science. They are, in fact, science communicators, and if they want to share their feedback, I think it will be good. TBV or Sabyasachi. Raghu, I don't know if he has left. No. So I think, yeah, I don't hear anything. So it looks like I think it's time to kind of close now. We had a very good session, and I would like to thank both speakers, Kohar Raja and Somnathanji, and also look forward for tomorrow's session on the other half of the STIP 2020. Sean, do you have to say anything?
No, I think pretty much you said it. Tomorrow's sessions again start at 6 o'clock, and we'll be having like three sessions. Yeah,
Yes.
I think that, yeah.
All right, yeah. And
Okay.
we apologize for today's some delay in the beginning for YouTube streaming. So I think it got sorted out. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.